What happens when a racist cop arrests a black man, thinking he's just another suspect, but then discovers he's an FBI agent? Officer Williams has no idea who he's dealing with. What starts as a routine arrest soon turns into a game changer. His world is flipped upside down in seconds. Will this cop's assumptions cost him everything? The truth is about to come out, and it's bigger than anything he imagined. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Stay till the end. You won't believe how this one ends. Let's dive in. Marcus Blackwood, a quiet, unassuming man, walked down the busy streets of downtown, unaware that today would change everything. On the outside, he was just another black man navigating the world, aware of the prejudice that came with it. But Marcus wasn't just anyone. He was an FBI agent. Years of working undercover had taught him to stay calm, stay composed, and never reveal too much. Today, he'd need every bit of his training. Officer Williams, on the other hand, was a man who saw the world in black and white. His uniform gave him a sense of control, and he carried his badge like a shield. But his assumptions were just as dangerous as his belief in his own authority. When he spotted Marcus, something about him rubbed him the wrong way. Without any real reason, Williams decided to make the stop. The downtown area was alive with noise and movement. Cars honked, people hurried along the sidewalk, and the sound of conversations filled the air. But for Marcus and Officer Williams, the world around them had just grown smaller. The traffic lights seemed to blur, the busy street became a silent battlefield, and the tension was building fast. It all started when Officer Williams decided to pull Marcus Blackwood over. It wasn't a big deal at first, just another traffic stop. But the moment the officer approached Marcus's car, things began to shift. Williams wasn't asking typical questions. His tone was sharp and suspicious, like he was expecting something to happen. "Where are you headed?" he barked. Marcus, feeling the tension in the air, answered calmly, "Just passing through." He handed over his ID, but Williams barely glanced at it. "Something's off about you," the officer muttered. Marcus was used to the looks, the judgment. But today, something felt different. He could sense the officer wasn't just pulling him over for a minor infraction. "Step out of the car," Williams ordered. Marcus hesitated. The air felt charged with an unsettling energy. He knew this wasn't about a simple ticket. It was about power and assumptions. As Marcus stepped out, Williams' attitude shifted to something far more confrontational. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," the officer demanded. Marcus remained calm, thinking, this isn't about the law anymore. He was now a target, not because of what he'd done, but because of who he was. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus asked quietly. The officer wasn't listening. "You're acting suspicious," Williams repeated, but there was no real reason for it. His judgment was clouded by his own biases. Marcus's patience was running out. He had endured these moments countless times, but today he wasn't going to let it go. "I'm an FBI agent," Marcus said, his voice steady. The officer froze. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Marcus had seen that moment before, the moment when someone realizes they've crossed a line. The officer stuttered. "What did you say?" "I'm an FBI agent," Marcus repeated, the weight of the words sinking in. The power had shifted, but not in the way Williams had expected. The moment Marcus revealed he was an FBI agent, the whole situation shifted. Officer Williams's body stiffened, his face draining of color. The arrogance that had filled him a moment ago was replaced with uncertainty. He had been so sure of himself, so convinced that Marcus was just another person he could bully with his badge. But now, the truth hit him like a ton of bricks. Marcus wasn't just anyone. He was someone with real power, someone who could make sure this moment would follow Williams for the rest of his life. For a brief second, there was complete silence. The officer stood frozen, unsure how to process what had just happened. The realization that he had made a massive mistake crashed over him. This wasn't just a minor misunderstanding. This was a failure of judgment, a failure of basic decency. Marcus didn't break eye contact. He knew that the officer would try to find a way out of this, maybe deny it, maybe apologize, but it wouldn't be enough. The damage had already been done. "You've just made a huge mistake," Marcus said. His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it. He wasn't angry, but the officer could hear the weight of his words. Williams tried to salvage the situation, but it was too late. He stammered, "I didn't know. I thought." His words trailed off, not even able to complete the thought. The officer's mind raced, looking for any way to justify what he'd just done. But he couldn't. Nothing could explain it. His actions were indefensible. "I don't care what you thought," Marcus replied, his calm demeanor never wavering. "You acted based on assumptions, and now you're facing the consequences." The officer opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He was trapped, his career teetering on the edge. He had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He wasn't just dealing with a civilian now. He was face to face with someone who could end his career, someone who knew the law better than he ever would. Marcus wasn't interested in getting the officer fired or ruining his life. What he wanted was something far more important, a lesson to be learned. "You don't get to treat people like that just because you think you can," he said. "This isn't just about me. This is about every person you've ever judged without even knowing their story." Williams swallowed hard. He had spent his entire career assuming that his position of power gave him the right to make these calls. He had acted on his bias, letting it guide him. But now, in front of Marcus, the reality of his actions was impossible to deny. It was clear that his entire worldview was built on a shaky foundation. "What happens next?" Williams asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't even look Marcus in the eye anymore. Marcus shook his head. "That's not up to me," he replied. "It's up to you to figure out how to live with this. And it's up to your department to decide what happens next." The weight of Marcus's words lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. Officer Williams had crossed a line, but now he was the one left to face the consequences of his actions. He had always seen himself as above the law, but now he understood just how quickly that could change. Marcus wasn't in the business of giving second chances. He wasn't there to forgive the officer. He was there to make a point, to show that people like Officer Williams couldn't get away with their biases anymore. "You might not understand it now," Marcus said quietly, "but today is the beginning of a change, whether you like it or not." The officer's face remained pale, but his lips trembled with something more than fear. Regret, shame, maybe even guilt. But it didn't matter. The truth had been laid bare. There was no going back now. Marcus took a step back, ready to leave. "Remember this moment," he said. "Remember what happens when you let your assumptions rule." As Marcus walked away, the officer stood there, frozen, unable to move. He had no idea how this would play out, but one thing was clear. His life had just changed. and no matter how hard he tried to avoid it, the truth would follow him. It was a truth he would never be able to escape. The tension in the air had barely settled when Marcus dropped the bombshell. Officer Williams, still reeling from the fact that he had nearly arrested an FBI agent, stood frozen, struggling to wrap his mind around everything that had just happened. He could feel his world crashing down. But Marcus wasn't done. There was more he needed to say, and this time, the truth was about to hit hard. "Officer Williams." Marcus started again, his voice calm, but there was a firmness to it that commanded attention. "You're not just dealing with me, you're dealing with a system that's broken. I'm not the first person you've made assumptions about, and I won't be the last. But you've just stepped into something that will cost more than just your reputation." Williams stood there, still processing what Marcus had just said. He had no idea what Marcus was referring to. He had thought he was dealing with one isolated incident, one moment of personal failure. But Marcus had just opened a door to something far deeper than that. "What do you mean?" Williams finally managed to ask, his voice strained, his face pale. Marcus didn't answer directly. Instead, he let his words hang in the air. "You think this is just about me. But there's more going on here. What happened today, what you did, it's just one example of a much larger issue. An issue you're a part of, whether you know it or not." Williams's heart started to race as the realization sank in. This wasn't just about a single bad judgment call. This was about something much bigger. He could feel the pressure building, the weight of Marcus's words bearing down on him. "The system that allows you to treat people like me this way is the same system that's been protecting cops like you for years," Marcus continued. "And you know what? It's about to come crumbling down." The officer's eyes widened in shock. "What do you mean by that?" "You're threatening me?" he said, his voice shaky. "No," Marcus responded simply. "I'm not threatening you. I'm giving you a chance to realize what's happening. I'm letting you know that the walls around people like you, people who abuse their power, are starting to crack. This moment, this mistake you made, it's part of a much bigger reckoning." Williams stood there, his mind spinning. He wanted to deny it, to brush off Marcus's words as just a man trying to defend himself after being caught. But deep down, he knew Marcus was right. The truth was right in front of him, undeniable, and it was much larger than he had ever imagined. Marcus's gaze never wavered. "You don't know how bad this is yet, but you will. I've seen the patterns. I've seen this happen before. People like you, police officers, think they can get away with this. They think the system will always protect them. But that's not true anymore." The officer's throat went dry. He had been blinded by his position, thinking that his badge would give him immunity. He thought the law was something that only applied to others. But now, facing an FBI agent, facing someone who knew the system from the inside, the truth was finally starting to sink in. "What happens now?" Williams asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus took a long breath, looking him straight in the eyes. "Now, we wait," he said. "We wait for the investigation that's coming your way. I don't have the power to change it on my own, but I know that things are about to change." As the words left his lips, Marcus turned to leave, his calmness unshaken. Williams stood still, staring at the ground, his mind racing. He knew that this encounter was just the beginning of something much bigger, something he couldn't undo. Marcus hadn't just exposed him as a racist cop. He had opened the floodgates for a much larger reckoning. It wasn't just about this one incident anymore. It was about a system that had allowed people like Officer Williams to act with impunity, and now that system was going to be held accountable. Williams could feel the weight of that truth in his chest, and for the first time in his life, he understood how fragile his sense of power really was. The walls around him were crumbling, and there was no stopping it. The fallout from that day didn't take long to start. Officer Williams found himself at the center of a growing storm. What seemed like an isolated incident had quickly become the spark for a much larger conversation. Marcus wasn't just fighting for his own dignity anymore. He was fighting for a truth that everyone had ignored for too long. The department had launched an internal investigation into Williams's actions. It wasn't just about this one stop. It was about the bigger pattern of bias, the way certain officers use their badge to cover up their prejudices. But the truth had already come out, and Marcus had done more than just reveal one officer's mistake. He had exposed a flaw in the system itself. For Marcus, the victory wasn't just in clearing his name. It was in showing that change was possible. Change didn't come from silence, from letting things slide because it was easier. It came from people who stood up and said, "This isn't right, and I'm not going to let it continue." The investigation into Williams turned into something far bigger, with multiple officers under scrutiny. Slowly but surely, the cracks in the department's protective barriers started to show. The power that people like Williams had once held so comfortably was now slipping through their fingers. The public pressure was mounting, and the people who had been silenced for so long finally began to speak. But even as the system began to unravel, Marcus knew the fight was far from over. Yes, Williams would face consequences, but what about the countless others who had been swept under the rug? The truth had come out about this one incident. But how many more were there? Marcus's battle had just begun, and he was ready. It wasn't about punishing one officer. It was about changing the way people saw the system. He wanted to show the world that accountability meant more than just a punishment. It meant real change. It meant ensuring that the next person who came across someone like Officer Williams wouldn't have to face the same fear, the same bias, the same wrongful assumptions. For Williams, the world had turned upside down. He had never imagined that one simple act of prejudice would lead to a chain of events that would destroy everything he had worked for. And while he faced the consequences of his actions, it wasn't just about him. It was about the bigger issue at play. The officer wasn't just a bad apple. He was part of a system that allowed his behavior to thrive. As Williams's world crumbled, Marcus moved forward. He knew he wasn't the only one who had faced discrimination, that he wasn't the only one who had fought to prove their worth in a world full of assumptions. But Marcus was different. He didn't let those assumptions define him. And in the end, it wasn't just about proving someone wrong. It was about proving that truth had power. The system that had protected men like Williams couldn't hold up forever. And Marcus had shown the world that it didn't matter how high you were, how much power you held. If you were wrong, the truth would always come for you. But for Marcus, the battle wasn't over. It would never be. There were still battles to fight, still changes to make. The world needed more people to stand up, to speak the truth. And Marcus knew that as long as he had the power to do so, he would keep fighting. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had ever been ignored. As the dust settled, Marcus knew this wasn't just his victory. This was a win for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly, everyone who had been made to feel smaller just because of who they were. The case against Officer Williams wasn't just about one racist cop. It was about the system that allowed his actions to go unchecked for so long. The truth had come out, and now it was up to all of us to make sure it didn't fade away. Marcus had taken a stand, not just for his own freedom, but for the freedom of those who didn't have the chance to speak up. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for anyone who had ever been discriminated against, for anyone who had been denied justice simply because they didn't fit a certain image. But the fight doesn't stop here. The system that allowed people like Officer Williams to act with impunity is still standing, and there's so much more work to be done. Marcus's battle is far from over. He's shown us that change starts with one person, one voice, but it takes all of us to make it happen. So, what can you do? How far are you willing to go to stand up for what's right? Drop a comment below and share your story. Have you ever faced a moment where standing up for the truth made all the difference? Let's keep this conversation going and keep pushing for justice. If you want to see more stories like this, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. This isn't just one man's fight. It's all of ours.